Okay, so your parents probably told you this rule at some point. Maybe a teacher did. Maybe you read it in some personal finance book with a guy in a suit on the cover. Save 20% of your income. Do that consistently, and you'll be fine. You'll retire comfortably, you'll have an emergency fund, you'll be one of the responsible ones. Here's the thing, that rule isn't just outdated. For a huge number of people following it perfectly, it is mathematically impossible, and nobody has bothered to update the advice. I want you to sit with that for a second, because if you've ever felt like a financial failure for not hitting that 20% mark, even though you're not overspending, you're not buying lattes you can't afford, you're not doing anything wrong, I need you to hear this. The rule broke. You didn't. Let's talk about where this number even came from, because that's actually the first clue that something's off. The 50-30-20 rule, 50% needs, 30% wants, 20% savings, was popularized back in 2005 in a book written by a senator, of all people. Elizabeth Warren, before she was a senator actually, when she was a Harvard bankruptcy researcher. And look, in the world she was describing, the math basically worked. Rent was a smaller slice of the average paycheck. A single income could often cover a household. Wages were roughly keeping pace with the cost of living. That world does not exist anymore. And I don't mean that in a vague, things are harder now kind of way. I mean it in a very specific, very measurable way. Let's do the actual math, because this is where it gets uncomfortable. Since 2000, median wages in the US have grown by roughly 100% in nominal terms. Sounds decent, right? Except housing costs, over that same window, have grown by significantly more in most major metro areas. In a lot of cities, home prices and rents have more than tripled. Meanwhile, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, overall inflation across that same period sits around 80 to 90%. So wages went up, sure, but the specific costs that eat the needs category of your budget went up faster. In some cases, much faster. Here's what that actually means in practice. The 50 in 50-30-20, the needs category, was never supposed to be the whole paycheck. It was supposed to be half, but for a huge number of renters right now, needs alone, rent, groceries, utilities, insurance, transportation, are eating 60, 65, sometimes 70% of take-home pay before a single want gets purchased. That's not a hypothetical. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies has tracked this for years, and their data consistently shows that a huge share of renters, millions of households, are what's classified as cost-burdened, meaning they're spending more than 30% of income on housing alone before anything else even enters the picture. So do the math with me for 1 second. If your needs category alone is already blowing past 50%, sometimes hitting 65 or 70%, there is no version of reality where 20% is left over for savings. The math doesn't lie. You cannot allocate more than 100% of a paycheck. If needs eat 65 and you still need groceries flexibility and, an actual human life in the wants category, the 20% isn't being ignored by lazy savers. It's being mathematically evicted from the budget before it ever had a chance. And this is the part that actually makes me a little frustrated, because here's what happens next. People run these numbers, realize they can't hit 20%, and instead of thinking, the model is broken, they think, I am broken. That's the real damage here. It's not just a math problem, it's a psychological one. Think about it like this. Imagine someone hands you a recipe that says, bake at 350 for 30 minutes. Except the recipe was written for an oven at sea level, and you're baking at 10,000 feet where water boils at a lower temperature and everything cooks differently. Follow that recipe exactly, and you will fail every single time. Not because you're a bad cook, but because the recipe was calibrated for different conditions. That's the 20% rule right now. It was calibrated for a different economic altitude, and millions of people are following it precisely and still failing, and blaming themselves for physics they didn't create. There's actual research on what this self-blame does to people, and it's worse than you'd think. A 2023 study published through the American Psychological Association's annual Stress in America survey found that money is consistently the #1 source of stress for American adults, ahead of work and even ahead of relationships. And one of the biggest predictors of financial anxiety isn't actually how much someone earns. It's the gap between what they think they should be able to do with their money and what they're actually able to do. That gap, that feeling of, I should be hitting this benchmark and I'm not, is doing more psychological damage than the actual numbers themselves. So here's the reveal, and I think this is the part that changes how you see your whole budget. The 20% rule isn't a law of nature. It's not gravity. It was a rough guideline built for a specific economic snapshot in 2005, and the world moved. Treating it like an unbreakable commandment instead of a rough starting point that needs recalibrating for your actual city, your actual rent, your actual paycheck, is like still using a paper map from 20 years ago and getting mad at yourself when the roads don't match. Now, I want to be really clear about something because I don't want this video to become an excuse to just give up on saving altogether. That's not the lesson here. The lesson is that the target needs to be personal and realistic, not borrowed from a book written for a different economy. So let's talk about what to actually do instead. First thing, and this is non-negotiable, calculate your actual needs percentage before you assign yourself any savings target. Add up rent, groceries, utilities, insurance, minimum debt payments, transportation. Divide that by your take-home pay. That number is your real starting point. If it comes out to 65%, that's not a moral failing, that's just data. You cannot set a savings goal in a vacuum. You have to know what's actually left first. Second, once you know your real needs number, work backward instead of forward. Instead of forcing 20% savings onto a budget that mathematically can't hold it, ask what percentage is actually achievable this year, even if it's 5%, even if it's 8%. Here's why this matters more than people think. Savings rate isn't actually the goal. Consistency is the goal. A sustainable 7% that you actually stick to every single month for 5 years will beat a fantasy 20% that collapses by March. Every single time. Because compound growth needs time far more than it needs a big starting number. Third, and this is the one people skip, separate "can't save right now" from "will never be able to save." Those are completely different situations that require completely different responses. If your needs number is genuinely eating 65% of your paycheck because of your specific city, your specific rent, that's a structural problem, and the fix might be increasing income or, eventually, relocating costs. Not just tightening a budget that's already stretched to its limit. Squeezing a budget that has no fat left to cut isn't discipline. It's just squeezing something that's already empty. Fourth, if you do have some flexibility in the wants category, this is where you actually have leverage. Because needs are largely fixed in the short term, but wants are the one lever you can pull immediately. Even shifting 5 percentage points from wants into savings, consistently, compounds into something real over years. This is not about eliminating joy from your life. It's about being intentional with the one flexible category you actually control. And fifth, track your real percentage over time, not against the old 20% commandment, but against your own baseline. Are you saving more this year than last year? That trend line matters infinitely more than hitting an arbitrary number lifted from a 2005 book that was never built for your rent, your city, or your paycheck. Here's what I really want you to walk away with. If you've been beating yourself up for years because you can't hit 20%, I need you to actually let that go, because you were measuring yourself against a ruler that was manufactured for a completely different economy. The people who are actually building wealth right now aren't the ones blindly following an old percentage. They're the ones who did the math on their actual life, set a real number, and stayed consistent with it for years, even when that number was smaller than what a book told them to aim for. You're not behind because you can't hit 20%. You might just be one of millions of people the math quietly stopped working for. And now that you can see it clearly, you get to build a target that's actually built for you. If this reframed how you think about your own budget, subscribe, because next week I'm breaking down the paycheck to paycheck trap that has nothing to do with how much you actually earn, and that one might hit even closer to home.